It was a calm, quiet evening at St. Mark's Trauma Center, just like many others before it. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting their pale glow across the clean, white-tiled hallways. The faint beeping of monitors mixed with the low murmur of voices from nurses and doctors. For most of the staff, it was business as usual. In the midst of this, Dr. Elena Carter prepared for her shift. She stood at the sink in the operating room, scrubbing her hands methodically, her movements precise and practiced. Water dripped from her elbows as she turned off the faucet and dried her hands, her face calm and focused. To the outside world, Elena might have seemed like just another surgeon. She wasn't flashy, didn't boast about her skills, and never sought the spotlight. She was the kind of person who blended into the background, quiet and unassuming. Her colleagues often described her the same way: Elena's solid. Keeps her head down. Always gets the job done. Some meant it as a compliment, while others said it with a hint of dismissal. To them, she was just the reliable surgeon who stayed in her lane, never making waves. But Elena didn't mind. She didn't care about what others thought of her. All she cared about was her work, her patients. Her sharp eyes and steady hands had saved countless lives, and she didn't need recognition to know her worth. Tonight, though, something felt different. Just as Elena finished tying her scrubs and started reviewing her patient files for the evening, the peaceful rhythm of the hospital was shattered. The distant sound of engines rumbled, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. A nurse at the front desk frowned, looking toward the entrance. Then came the unmistakable roar of motorcycles, reverberating through the air like a storm rolling in. The noise wasn't just loud, it was unnerving. It carried with it an energy that made everyone pause. The staff exchanged uneasy glances as the roar grew deafening, and before long, it became clear the sound was headed straight for the hospital. The double doors of the emergency room burst open with a loud clang, and in stormed a group of bikers. They were a sight to behold, dressed in black leather jackets patched with a fierce emblem, a snarling wolf's head and the words Iron Fang stitched across the back. They moved like a pack, their heavy boots thudding against the floor as they carried one of their own, a man whose leg was covered in blood, his face twisted in pain. The leader of the group, a towering man with a shaved head and a thick beard, barked orders as they marched into the hospital. He was a menacing figure, broad-shouldered and clad in a jacket covered with pins and patches that told stories of countless fights and long rides. His name, Razor, was stitched in bold letters over his chest. Razor's voice boomed across the room as he pointed to the injured man. "Get someone to fix him. Now." The staff froze. Nurses and orderlies stood in stunned silence, unsure how to respond to the sudden invasion. Razor's gang wasn't just loud, they were intimidating. Their presence filled the room with tension, and their piercing glares warned everyone not to get on their bad side. The injured man groaned, clutching his leg as blood seeped through the makeshift bandage tied around it. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a crooked nose, muttered, "He's losing too much blood, Razor. He needs help now." Razor's gaze swept over the staff, his sharp eyes daring anyone to step forward. Finally, his glare landed on Dr. Elena Carter. She was standing near the nurse's station, clipboard in hand, watching the scene unfold with a calm expression. Razor smirked. "You." He jabbed a finger in her direction. "You're the doctor, right? Fix him. And you better do it fast." Elena didn't flinch. She met Razor's eyes without hesitation, her calm demeanor unwavering. To an outsider, she might have seemed unaffected by the chaos, but her mind was already racing. "She better fix him fast," Razor growled, taking a step closer. His voice dropped to a threatening tone, low and dangerous. "Or there'll be hell to pay." The hospital staff exchanged nervous glances, but Elena remained still, her face giving nothing away. Razor's presence was overpowering, but she didn't let it rattle her. Instead, she glanced at the injured man, assessing his condition with a practiced eye. "Get him into trauma room too," Elena said, her voice steady and professional. She turned to the nearest nurse, motioning for a gurney. "Let's move quickly. He's lost a lot of blood, but we can save the leg if we act now." Razor raised an eyebrow at her tone. It wasn't defiant, but it wasn't submissive either. It was calm, controlled, something he wasn't used to encountering. As the gang hoisted their injured comrade onto the gurney and began wheeling him toward the trauma room, Razor followed closely, his boots echoing loudly against the floor. He leaned in toward Elena as she walked beside the gurney, his voice a low growl. "You'd better not mess this up, Doc," he said. "If he doesn't walk out of here, neither do you." Elena glanced at him briefly, her face unreadable. "I'll do my job," she replied simply. But beneath her calm exterior, Elena's mind was already processing the situation. She wasn't just thinking about the surgery ahead. She was thinking about Razor, his gang, and the uneasy feeling that this night was far from over. As the trauma room doors swung shut behind her, the hospital staff outside whispered among themselves. "Who are these guys?" one nurse asked, her voice trembling. "Biker gang," another whispered. "The Iron Fangs. You don't mess with them. They're dangerous." But inside the trauma room, Elena Carter wasn't thinking about danger. She wasn't thinking about the Iron Fangs or their reputation. She was thinking about the patient on the table, the tools she needed, and the job she had to do. To the bikers, she was just another doctor, someone they could intimidate, someone who would cower under their threats. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Dr. Elena Carter moved quickly, her steady hands working alongside the nurses to prepare the trauma room. The injured biker groaned in pain, his breaths shallow as blood seeped through the crude bandages wrapped around his thigh. A jagged piece of metal was lodged deep in his flesh, a result of some accident or altercation the gang had yet to mention. "Elena, are you sure about this?" whispered Nurse Morgan, who had followed her into the room. She kept her voice low, her eyes darting toward the door as if Razor or one of his gang members might burst in at any moment. Elena glanced up from her preparations, her expression calm but firm. "We don't have a choice, Morgan. He's losing too much blood. If we don't act now, he could go into shock." Morgan nodded hesitantly and began assisting. But her hands trembled slightly, and she kept looking over her shoulder toward the observation window, where two of the bikers stood watching like hawks. Outside the trauma room, Razor leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, his intense gaze fixed on the small team working on his comrade. His presence alone made everyone uneasy. The rest of his gang lounged in the waiting area, but there was nothing casual about their posture. They were alert, tense, and clearly ready to pounce at the slightest provocation. "Think she knows what she's doing?" one of the bikers muttered, his voice gruff but laced with doubt. "She better," Razor replied coldly, his eyes never leaving the trauma room. "Or she'll regret it." Inside the room, Elena worked swiftly, directing the nurses with quiet authority. She asked for tools, sponges, and sutures in a tone that brooked no hesitation. Despite the tension in the air, she remained composed, her focus unshakable. "Get me a clamp," she said, her voice steady as she examined the wound. "We need to stop the bleeding before we can remove the metal. Morgan, start a second, for he's going to need more fluids." The injured man let out a groan, his body jerking slightly as Elena adjusted the position of his leg. "Easy," she murmured, her tone soft but firm. "You're going to be okay. Just hang in there." The man's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and he tried to speak, but his words came out as a slurred mumble. Elena leaned closer, her calm eyes meeting his. "Don't try to talk. Save your strength. We'll take care of you." As the team worked, the tension in the room began to ease at least slightly. The nurses, reassured by Elena's calm demeanor, found their own rhythm and began to focus on the task at hand. The blood flow was slowing, the patient's vital signs were stabilizing, and Elena's precise movements left no doubt that she knew exactly what she was doing. But the unease from outside the trauma room lingered, a constant presence that couldn't be ignored. Razor's voice, low and threatening, filtered in through the door as he spoke to one of his gang members. "How long is this going to take?" he demanded. "They're taking too damn long." "Boss, they're doing surgery," the younger biker replied cautiously. "That kind of thing takes time." "I don't care," Razor snapped. "They better not screw this up." Back in the trauma room, Elena pretended not to notice the shadowy figures pacing outside the window. But Morgan couldn't help herself. Her eyes darted toward the observation glass again, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. "Why do they have to stand there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's like they're watching every move we make." Elena didn't look up from her work. "Let them watch," she said simply, her voice calm. "We have a job to do, and I'm not about to let them intimidate me." Morgan gave a nervous laugh. "You make it sound easy." Elena finally looked up, meeting the nurse's worried gaze. "It's not easy. But it's necessary. Focus on the patient, Morgan. The rest doesn't matter right now." The nurse nodded, drawing strength from Elena's calm presence. With the bleeding under control, Elena carefully began removing the jagged piece of metal from the biker's leg. It was a delicate procedure, requiring precision and patience. One wrong move could cause further damage or set off a cascade of complications. As she worked, Elena couldn't help but think about the events that had led to this moment. She had no idea what had brought the Iron Fangs to the hospital tonight, but one thing was clear: Razor and his gang weren't the type to show up quietly. Whatever had happened out on the road or wherever they had come from was likely trouble. The injured man let out another groan, his body tensing as Elena adjusted the angle of the metal shard. "Almost there," she said softly, her tone reassuring. "Just a little more, and we'll have it out." Outside, Razor's patience was wearing thin. He stepped closer to the trauma room door, his sharp eyes narrowing as he peered through the glass. "What's taking so long?" he barked, his voice loud enough to be heard inside. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even glance in his direction. Instead, she kept her focus on the task in front of her. "Almost done," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Finally, with one last careful maneuver, the piece of metal came free. Elena set it aside and quickly began cleaning the wound, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Got it," she said, glancing at Morgan. "Now let's close him up." Morgan nodded and handed her the sutures, her hands steady now. Together, they worked quickly to finish the procedure, their movements smooth and coordinated. When it was done, Elena stepped back and let out a small breath. The patient's vitals were stable, and the wound was clean and neatly stitched. "He's going to be fine," she said, her voice calm but firm. Morgan gave her a relieved smile. "You did it?" Elena nodded, already removing her gloves and washing her hands. "Let's move him to recovery." As the nurses wheeled the patient out of the trauma room, Razor and his gang immediately closed in. Razor's sharp eyes scanned the injured man, his expression hard to read. "He's stable," Elena said, stepping forward to address Razor directly. Her tone was calm, professional, but not without a hint of firmness. "The surgery went well. He'll need rest and antibiotics to prevent infection, but he should make a full recovery." Razor didn't respond right away. He studied her with a cold, calculating gaze, as if trying to decide whether to believe her. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Good." But then he stepped closer, invading her personal space. He was taller than her by at least a foot, and his presence was overwhelming, like a storm cloud ready to burst. "Let me make one thing clear, Doc," he said, his voice low and dangerous. If anything happens to him, anything at all, you'll answer to me. Elena met his gaze without flinching. I've done my job, she said simply. Now it's up to him to heal. For a moment, Razor said nothing. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. You've got guts, he said, his tone almost amused. I'll give you that. Elena didn't respond. She simply turned and walked away, leaving Razor and his gang to their whispers and threats. But as she headed back to the nurse's station, her mind was already turning. She had handled the situation for now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Elena didn't flinch, though the nurses around her exchanged uneasy glances. Razor's sneer widened as if he could smell their fear. What's the matter, Doc? Never seen a real man bleed before, he mocked, his voice dripping with contempt. His gang erupted into harsh laughter, the sound echoing in the sterile hallway like a threat. The hospital staff began whispering to one another in hushed voices. A few took small, cautious steps backward, their fear obvious in their body language. Razor and his gang radiated danger, and it was clear to everyone in the room that these men weren't used to being told no. Elena, however, didn't react to the taunt. She stood her ground, her hands steady as she tightened her gloves with a deliberate calm. Her silence only seemed to agitate Razor further. He leaned in closer, his imposing frame towering over her. You deaf or just scared, Doc? He growled, his voice low and menacing. I said you'd better fix him. If you don't, he trailed off, letting the weight of his words sink in. Behind him, the other bikers chuckled, their smirks oozing arrogance. One of them, a wiry man with a snake tattoo curling up his neck, added, Razor doesn't like to wait, sweetheart. If you mess this up, we might just have to adjust your attitude. The tension in the room was suffocating. The nurses froze, their faces pale. One of them, a young intern named Lily, looked like she was about to cry. But Elena remained composed. Her voice, calm but firm, cut through the air like a scalpel. Get him into trauma room too. I'll take care of it. Her tone left no room for argument, and for a moment, even Razor looked caught off guard. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, especially not someone as seemingly unthreatening as Dr. Carter. But the surprise quickly melted into a dark chuckle. You'd better, Razor said, his tone dripping with menace. Or we're not leaving without some payback. The nurses hesitated, their movements jerky as they worked to transfer the injured man onto a stretcher. The gang members loomed close, watching every move like predators circling prey. Razor stayed near Elena, his piercing gaze tracking her every step as she guided the team into the trauma room. Morgan, the senior nurse on duty, leaned in toward Elena as they moved. Her voice was barely a whisper. Elena, are you sure about this? These guys, they're dangerous. I know, Elena replied softly, her eyes fixed ahead. But I don't have a choice. He's losing blood fast, and if we don't act now, he's not going to make it. Just stay calm and follow my lead. Morgan bit her lip but nodded, trusting Elena's judgment even as the fear in her chest refused to subside. In the waiting area, the remaining bikers spread out like a swarm of dark clouds. Their heavy boots clomped against the tile floor, and their loud, crude voices filled the space. They laughed and jeered, paying no mind to the uneasy glances from patients and staff. Look at this place, one of them sneered, kicking over a chair with a loud clatter. Bunch of uptight pencil pushers. Bet none of 'em could handle a real fight. Another biker, a hulking man with a scar running down his cheek, grinned. Nah, they'd fold faster than cheap paper. Ain't that right, folks? He turned to a pair of terrified visitors huddled in a corner, flashing them a grin that was anything but friendly. The visitors didn't respond, their faces pale. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. In trauma room 2, Elena worked quickly, her steady hands moving with practiced precision as she assessed the biker's injuries. The jagged piece of metal lodged in his leg was deep, dangerously close to a major artery. Removing it would require extreme care. Hook him up to a second floor, Elena instructed Morgan. He's going to need more fluids. Morgan nodded and got to work, her hands shaking slightly as she inserted the needle. Outside the trauma room, Razor stood with his arms crossed, peering through the glass window with a sharp, scrutinizing gaze. He didn't say a word, but his presence alone was enough to unnerve the entire team. "I don't like this," Morgan whispered as she adjusted the floor. "I don't like this one bit." "Just focus on the patient," Elena said calmly, her voice steady. "He's our priority." Morgan glanced at her, marveling at how composed she was. It wasn't that Elena was oblivious to the danger, they both knew what these men were capable of. But somehow, Elena managed to push past the fear and focus entirely on the task at hand. "Dr. Carter," a deep voice called from outside the room. Elena paused for half a second before turning to the door. Razor's piercing eyes met hers through the glass. "Is he gonna make it?" he asked, his tone even but heavy with unspoken threats. Elena met his gaze without flinching. "I'll do everything I can," she said firmly. Razor held her stare for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Good," he said. Because if he doesn't, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. As the minutes dragged on, the gang's impatience grew. One of the bikers, the wiry man with the snake tattoo, started pacing the hallway outside the trauma room. "What's taking so long?" he muttered. "It's just a leg. How hard can it be?" "Relax, Viper," Razor said without looking at him. "Let the doc work." But Viper wasn't in the mood to relax. He turned his attention to one of the nurses passing by, a timid woman who flinched as he blocked her path. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, leering at her. "How about you tell us what's going on in there?" I don't know," the nurse stammered, her voice trembling. "I'm not part of that team." Viper frowned, his expression darkening. "You don't know, or you don't want to tell me?" "Enough," Razor barked, his voice sharp. "Back off, Viper." Viper scowled but stepped away, muttering under his breath. Inside the trauma room, Elena carefully extracted the metal shard from the biker's leg, her movements deliberate and precise. She could feel the weight of Razor's gaze on her through the window, but she didn't let it distract her. "Got it," she said softly as she set the shard aside. "Now let's clean the wound and close him up." Morgan let out a small sigh of relief, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. "You're incredible, Elena," she whispered. Elena gave her a faint smile but didn't respond. There was still work to be done, and she wasn't about to let her guard down. As she stitched the wound, her thoughts flickered briefly to Razor and his gang. She didn't know what kind of world they came from, but it was clear that they thrived on fear and intimidation. But Elena wasn't easily intimidated. She had faced her share of challenges in the operating room, life and death decisions, high-pressure situations, and moments where even a fraction of a second could mean the difference between saving a life or losing it. She wasn't about to let a group of bikers shake her resolve. As the minutes ticked by, the waiting area grew louder. Razor's crew, unused to being kept waiting or feeling powerless, began to show their frustration in increasingly destructive ways. A biker with a bushy beard and a menacing scowl leaned against the vending machine, slamming his fist into its side. "Damn thing ate my dollar," he growled. "Maybe it's smarter than you," Snake Tattoo Viper snickered, earning a round of laughter from the others. Beard scowled but didn't retort. Instead, he gave the machine one last kick, sending it rattling loudly against the wall. A few bystanders flinched, clutching their belongings and inching further away. The gang's antics were escalating, and the hospital security staff had started to hover nearby, their walkie-talkies crackling softly. But no one dared intervene. Razor, leaning against a pillar with his arms crossed, radiated a silent authority that warned against any interference. Inside Trauma Room 2, Elena's focus never wavered. She worked meticulously, her movements quick yet precise as she cleaned and stitched the biker's wound. Blood still seeped through the bandages, but the bleeding had slowed significantly. Morgan glanced nervously toward the window. "They're getting rowdy out there," she whispered. "I know," Elena replied without looking up. "But we're almost done. Hang in there." Just as Elena tied off the last suture, a loud bang echoed from the waiting area. Razor's voice followed, low and commanding. "Everyone shut up." The room fell silent. Elena exchanged a glance with Morgan before stepping toward the door. She pushed it open to see Razor standing in the middle of the waiting area, his eyes locked on a security guard who looked like he was reconsidering his career choices. The guard, a young man in his early 20s, held a taser in trembling hands. I need you guys to calm down," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Razor's lip curled into a smirk. "Calm down? We're just having a little fun. Isn't that right, boys?" The gang erupted into laughter, their voices booming through the hall. "Enough." Elena's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. All eyes turned to her. Razor's smirk faltered ever so slightly, but he quickly recovered. "What's the matter, Doc? Finished already?" "Your friend is stable," Elena said, her tone steady. "He's lucky the shard didn't hit an artery. But he'll need to stay here for monitoring." Razor took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. The hospital staff held their breath, unsure of what he would do next. "And," he drawled, tilting his head. "And," Elena continued, meeting his gaze unflinchingly, "you and your friends need to stop intimidating my staff. I won't tolerate it." A stunned silence fell over the room. No one, not the nurses, not the gang, not even Razor, seemed to believe what they just heard. Razor's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing as a dangerous grin spread across his face. He took another step closer, invading Elena's personal space. "You've got guts, Doc," he said, his voice low. "I'll give you that. But you're not exactly in a position to make demands." Elena didn't back down. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to show any sign of fear. "This is my hospital," she said firmly. "And you're a guest here. If you can't behave like one, you can leave." The gang members exchanged incredulous looks, clearly entertained by her boldness. "Looks like the doc's got some fight in her after all," Viper said, chuckling. Razor's grin widened. "You think you can boss me around?" "I think you care about your friend enough to listen," Elena replied, her voice calm but resolute. "Unless you'd prefer to take him somewhere else." The challenge hung in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like Razor might explode. But then he threw his head back and laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed through the halls. "All right, Doc," he said, his tone almost amused. "You win. We'll behave. For now." The tension in the room eased slightly, though the unease lingered. Razor's words might have sounded like an agreement, but his smirk suggested he wasn't done testing her. As Razor returned to his crew, Elena let out a quiet breath, her calm facade unbroken. She turned to Morgan, who was standing near the trauma room door, wide-eyed. "Are you insane?" Morgan whispered harshly. "Do you realize who you just stood up to?" "I realize exactly who they are," Elena replied. "But if we let them push us around, it'll only get worse." Morgan shook her head, her expression a mix of admiration and disbelief. "You're braver than me, that's for sure." "I'm not brave," Elena said quietly. "I'm just doing my job." Back in the waiting area, Razor leaned against the wall, watching Elena through narrowed eyes. She intrigued him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Most people cowered in his presence, but not her. She'd stood up to him without so much as blinking, and that kind of nerve was rare. She's got a backbone, that one, Viper muttered, following Razor's gaze. Yeah, Razor said thoughtfully. She does. The injured biker, now conscious but groggy, let out a weak chuckle. Don't get any ideas, boss. She's all business. Razor smirked. Maybe. But I like to know who I'm dealing with. As the hours wore on, the tension in the hospital didn't dissipate. The gang remained in the waiting area, their presence a constant source of unease for the staff and patients alike. Elena, meanwhile, focused on her rounds. She checked in on the biker in trauma room 2, ensuring his vitals were stable and his wound was healing properly. Despite the chaos outside, she maintained her composure, refusing to let Razor and his crew distract her. But even as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was far from over. Razor wasn't the type to back down easily, and she suspected he was still testing her, watching, waiting for her to slip up. In the back of her mind, she began to prepare for the possibility that things could escalate further. And if they did, she knew she'd have to be ready. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Elena's calm precision contrasted sharply with the biker's unruly presence, a glaring reminder of the fragile line between chaos and control. As she carefully worked on the injured man, Razor's taunts grew louder, like a predator testing its prey. You better not mess this up, Doc. His bike's worth more than your whole paycheck, he sneered, his lips curling into a smirk. Elena didn't flinch. She maintained her focus, her fingers working quickly to stitch the deep gash in the biker's leg. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room aside from Razor's jabs. Her hands are steady as hell, the younger biker, who seemed barely out of his teens, whispered to Viper. Quiet, kid, Viper hissed back, though his own eyes were glued to Elena's movements. The younger biker, nicknamed Ace, couldn't shake the feeling that Elena was different. Most people wilted under Razor's stare, but she didn't even blink. Her hands moved with a purpose, every action calculated and efficient. Boss, Ace whispered to Razor, nudging him. She's got skills. Look at the way she's stitching him up like she's done this 1,000 times. Razor shot him a glare, but the corner of his mouth twitched in grudging acknowledgement. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone like her, a quiet, unassuming woman who didn't look like she belonged anywhere near their world. Yet here she was, fixing up his man without a hint of hesitation. Elena's voice broke through their murmurs. He's stable for now, but the wound was deep. He's going to need antibiotics and a few days of rest to avoid infection. She finally looked up, her gaze meeting Razor's. If he tries to get back on a bike anytime soon, he'll risk tearing those stitches. You'll need to keep him off his feet. Razor chuckled, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Sure, Doc. I'll just tuck him into bed and read him a bedtime story. Anything else? Elena didn't respond to his sarcasm. Instead, she turned to Morgan, who was standing frozen by the doorway. Get his vitals checked every hour, she instructed. Morgan nodded, her eyes darting nervously between Elena and the gang. As Elena left the trauma room, the bikers trailed behind her like a pack of wolves. Their heavy boots echoed against the hospital's sterile tiles, drawing uneasy stares from staff and patients alike. What's your deal, Doc? Razor asked, his tone laced with mockery. You're not scared of us, are you? Elena stopped and turned to face him. I've seen worse, she said simply, her expression unreadable. Her response caught Razor off guard. For a moment, he studied her, trying to decipher whether she was bluffing or genuinely unshaken. The rest of the gang seemed equally baffled. Worse than us. Viper chimed in, a smirk playing on his lips. I'd love to hear that story. Elena didn't answer. Instead, She walked away, her lab coat billowing behind her as she disappeared down the hallway. Back at the nurse's station, Morgan was practically shaking. "Are you insane?" she hissed at Elena when she returned. "You can't just talk to them like that. Do you have any idea who they are?" "I know exactly who they are," Elena replied calmly, grabbing a chart from the desk. "But I also know they won't risk their friend's life by starting a fight here." Morgan wasn't convinced. "You're playing with fire, Elena. Razor's not the kind of guy you want to cross." "I'm not crossing him," Elena said, her voice firm. "I'm doing my job." Morgan shook her head. "You're not scared of anything, are you?" Elena didn't answer. Instead, she turned her attention back to the chart in her hand, her face unreadable. Meanwhile, Razor was leaning against the wall in the waiting area, his sharp eyes fixed on Elena. There was something about her that didn't sit right with him. She wasn't like the other doctors he'd encountered, nervous, fidgety, desperate to please. No, this one was different. "Boss," Ace said quietly, nudging Razor's arm. "You think she's military or something? She's got that vibe, you know." Razor didn't respond immediately. He was still watching Elena, his mind working through possibilities. Her steady hands, her calm demeanor, the way she seemed completely unfazed by their presence, it all pointed to someone who had been through more than she let on. "Maybe," Razor muttered. "Or maybe she's just crazy." Ace shrugged, though he didn't seem convinced. "She's not scared of you, that's for sure." That last comment made Razor chuckle. "Well, we'll see about that." As the night dragged on, the bikers began to notice more about Elena. She moved with a quiet confidence, her posture straight and her gaze sharp. Even when she thought no one was watching, there was an edge to her movements, like a coiled spring, ready to snap into action at a moment's notice. "She's got secrets," Viper said, leaning against the counter next to Razor. "Everyone's got secrets," Razor replied. "Yeah, but hers are interesting," Viper said with a smirk. Razor didn't respond, but the glint in his eyes suggested he was starting to agree. It wasn't until later that night that Razor got his first real clue about Elena's past. While pacing the hallway, he overheard two nurses talking in hushed voices near the break room. "Did you hear about Dr. Carter?" one of them whispered. "Yeah," the other replied, her voice tinged with awe. "She used to work overseas. Some kind of special trauma unit or something. They say she saved dozens of soldiers under fire." Razor's ears perked up. "Soldiers? Under fire? That didn't sound like your average surgeon." The nurse continued, her voice dropping even lower. "I heard she got a medal for bravery. But she never talks about it." The second nurse gasped softly. "No wonder she's so calm under pressure." Razor leaned back against the wall, a slow grin spreading across his face. So, the quiet little doctor wasn't so ordinary after all. Razor returned to his crew, his mood noticeably lighter. "Looks like our doc's got some skeletons in her closet," he said, his tone amused. "What do you mean?" Viper asked. "She's seen combat," Razor replied. "Real combat?" The gang exchanged skeptical glances. "Combat?" Viper scoffed. "She doesn't look like the type." "Exactly," Razor said, his grin widening. "Which makes it even more interesting." Ace, who had been quietly listening, frowned. "Maybe we should back off, boss. If she's been through that kind of stuff." Razor's expression hardened. "Don't be soft, kid. I'm not backing off. I just want to see what makes her tick." As the night wore on, Razor's curiosity about Elena only grew. He watched her from a distance, noting the way she interacted with her staff and patients. There was a quiet strength in her that he couldn't ignore, a strength that intrigued and irritated him in equal measure. Elena, for her part, remained focused on her work, seemingly oblivious to Razor's scrutiny. But deep down, she knew the gang leader wasn't done testing her. And as the clock ticked toward dawn, the uneasy truce between them began to feel more like the calm before the storm. The uneasy calm stretched into the early hours of the morning. Razor's crew was restless, pacing the waiting area or slouching in chairs, their heavy boots and leather jackets an intimidating sight for the hospital staff. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances as they moved about their work, careful not to draw attention. Razor leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on Elena whenever she passed. He was quiet now, his earlier bravado replaced by a calculating expression. The air between them was charged, like the static before a lightning strike. Elena remained composed, but beneath her professional demeanor, she was acutely aware of Razor's watchful gaze. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, but she refused to let it rattle her. It was nearing 3 a.m. when chaos erupted once again. The doors to the ER swung open, and a man stumbled in, clutching his side. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his shirt. "Gunshot wound," a nurse called out, rushing to assist. Elena was already moving. She grabbed a pair of gloves and directed the team to wheel the man into a trauma bay. As she prepared to assess the wound, she caught a glimpse of Razor watching from the doorway, his eyes narrowing. The injured man was young, maybe in his mid-20s, and clearly terrified. "Please," he gasped. "Don't let them find me." Elena's brow furrowed, but she didn't ask questions. Her focus was on stopping the bleeding and stabilizing him. But Razor, ever observant, had caught the man's words. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. "Interesting," Razor said, his voice low and dangerous. "Looks like this one's running from something." "Out," Elena said firmly, not even looking up. "This is a sterile area. You can wait outside." Razor raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being ordered around. "You're awfully bold for someone in your position, Doc." Elena finally met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "And you're wasting my time. Let me do my job." For a moment, the two locked eyes, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then, to everyone's surprise, Razor chuckled and stepped back. "Fine," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Do your thing, Doc. But don't say I didn't warn you." As the hours passed, Razor's interest in Elena only deepened. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. She was too calm, too composed, like someone who had seen and done things most people couldn't imagine. He started asking questions, subtle at first, probing for information. "So, Doc," he said casually as she walked past him in the hallway, "what made you want to cut people open for a living?" Elena didn't break stride. "Saving lives seemed like a better use of my time than breaking them." The answer was sharp, almost cutting, and it left Razor momentarily speechless. Meanwhile, Ace couldn't help but be impressed by Elena. Her confidence, her skill, and her refusal to be intimidated, it was unlike anything he'd seen before. "She's something else, huh?" Ace said to Viper as they loitered near the vending machines. Viper scoffed. "She's just a doc. Don't get all starry-eyed." "She's not just anything," Ace muttered under his breath. In the quiet hours before dawn, Razor's curiosity led him to dig deeper. He cornered one of the younger nurses, flashing a wolfish grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Tell me something," he said, his voice smooth but menacing. "What's the deal with your doc? She always this icy, or is that just for me?" The nurse hesitated, glancing around nervously. I don't know what you mean." Razor leaned in closer, his smile widening. "Come on. You've worked with her, right? What's her story?" The nurse swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't really know much about her. She's private." "Private, huh?" Razor echoed, his tone laced with intrigue. That just makes me more curious. Back in the trauma bay, the young man with the gunshot wound was stable but weak. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at Elena with desperation. "They'll come for me," he whispered. "They always do." "Who?" Elena asked, keeping her voice calm and steady. "The Iron Fangs," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Elena's heart skipped a beat, but her expression didn't change. "You're safe here," she said firmly. The man shook his head. "No one's safe from them." Unbeknownst to him, Razor was standing just outside the room, his sharp ears picking up every word. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the hospital windows, the tension reached a boiling point. Razor and his crew had settled into a tense, watchful silence, their earlier bravado giving way to something more calculating. Elena, however, remained as calm as ever. She moved through the ER with her usual quiet efficiency, her focus unwavering. But inside, she was preparing. She had seen men like Razor before, men who thrived on fear and control. And she knew they weren't done testing her. By now, the hospital staff had pieced together bits of Elena's past from whispered conversations and snippets of gossip. The story of her time overseas had spread, and while most people didn't know the full details, it was enough to spark a mix of awe and curiosity. She was in the middle of a war zone, one nurse whispered to another. Saving soldiers under fire. Can you imagine? I heard she disarmed a guy once, another added, her eyes wide. Barehanded. Whether the stories were true or exaggerated didn't matter. The legend of Dr. Elena Carter was growing, and Razor's crew was starting to take notice. Razor, however, wasn't one to be outdone. The more he learned about Elena, the more determined he became to crack her composure. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, and he wasn't about to let a quiet surgeon make him look weak in front of his crew. "Let's see what she's really made of," he said to Viper, a wicked grin on his face. But as the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that Razor was playing a dangerous game and Elena was far from the easy target he had assumed. Razor's sneer faltered for just a moment, replaced by something almost resembling doubt. The room was thick with tension, the kind that felt like it could snap at any second. Elena's eyes stayed fixed on him, steady and unwavering, as though daring him to make the next move. The younger biker, Ace, spoke again, a little louder this time. "She's serious, boss. Let's just leave. The doc saved Red's life. That should be enough." But Razor wasn't a man who backed down easily. His pride was a fortress, and Elena's calm defiance was a battering ram. He stepped closer, looming over her, his voice dripping with menace. "You think you can scare me, Doc? Navy or not, you don't know who you're messing with." Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, her voice quiet but sharp as a blade. "You're right. I don't know you. But I know your type." She tilted her head, her expression still calm. "You think you can walk in here, bully people, throw your weight around. But here's the thing, my operating room isn't a bar. It's not your turf. And if you want to test me, you'll find out just how quickly I can handle someone like you." Her words weren't loud, but they were piercing. Each syllable was deliberate, slicing through Razor's posturing like she was exposing a wound. For a moment, no one moved. The bikers, once brash and loud, were eerily silent. Even Razor's crew seemed unsure. Ace shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between Razor and Elena. Viper, Razor's right-hand man, muttered something under his breath, but it wasn't enough to break the tension. And then, Razor laughed. It was short, bitter, and hollow, more a bark than a laugh. "You've got guts, Doc. I'll give you that." He straightened up, his grin returning, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "But guts only get you so far. Elena crossed her arms, her expression neutral but firm. And arrogance gets you nowhere. Ace, emboldened by Elena's calm strength, stepped forward. Boss, seriously. Let it go. Red's alive because of her. Isn't that what matters? Razor shot him a glare, but Ace didn't back down. It was the first crack in Razor's control, and everyone saw it. Razor took a step back, pacing now, his mind racing. He wasn't used to this, being challenged, being made to look weak in front of his crew. But something in Elena's presence made him hesitate. She wasn't just another face in a crowd. She was unshakable, like a mountain in a storm. Finally, Razor stopped and turned to face her again. You talk a big game, Doc. But words are cheap. Elena took a deliberate step forward, closing the gap between them. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. Do you know what happens when someone threatens my staff or my patients? Razor raised an eyebrow, his grin fading slightly. They get removed, Elena said simply. And if necessary, they get reconstructed. You're not the first bully I've dealt with, Razor. And if you think your gang gives you power, you're wrong. All I need is one call, and you'll learn exactly how powerless you are in my world. Her words were delivered with such quiet authority that even the air seemed to still. The impact of Elena's words rippled through the room. The bikers, who had been so sure of their leader's invincibility, were starting to waver. Ace looked at Elena with something like admiration, while others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Razor's gaze. Even Razor couldn't hide the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted him. 2 security guards entered the room, flanked by a tall man in a crisp suit. It was the hospital administrator, Mr. Logan. His expression was stern as he surveyed the scene. What's going on here? Logan demanded, his voice carrying authority. Razor turned to him, his bravado returning in a flash. Nothing to worry about. Just checking on our buddy, Red. Logan's eyes narrowed. This is a hospital, not a clubhouse. If you're causing trouble, I'll have the police here in minutes. Elena stepped forward before Razor could respond. Mr. Logan, the situation is under control. She looked directly at Razor, her gaze unyielding. Isn't it? Razor hesitated, his jaw tightening. He glanced at his crew, then back at Elena. For a moment, it seemed like he might push back, but then he let out a frustrated sigh. Yeah, he muttered. We're done here. As the bikers began to shuffle out, Razor paused at the door. He turned back to Elena, his expression a mix of anger and reluctant respect. You're lucky you've got skills, Doc. But don't think this is over. Elena didn't respond. She simply watched as Razor and his crew disappeared through the double doors. When they were gone, the room seemed to exhale. Nurses and staff exchanged relieved glances, and Mr. Logan gave Elena a small nod of approval before leaving. Ace was the last to go. He lingered by the door, his eyes meeting Elena's. For what it's worth, he said quietly, thanks for saving Red. And, sorry about Razor. He's, well, you know. Elena gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Take care of yourself, Ace. With the bikers gone, the ER returned to its usual rhythm. Elena retreated to her office, finally allowing herself a moment to breathe. She closed her eyes, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. She had faced men like Razor before, men who thought power came from fear. But Elena knew better. True power came from control, from precision, from knowing when to stand your ground and when to strike. By the time the morning shift arrived, the story of Dr. Carter's confrontation with Razor was already spreading. Staff members whispered in the halls, their voices tinged with awe. Did you hear what she said to him? She didn't even blink. Razor. Of all people. And he backed down. Elena didn't pay much attention to the gossip. She had patients to see, lives to save. But as she walked through the hospital, there was a subtle shift in the way people looked at her. For the first time, they didn't just see a quiet surgeon. They saw someone unshakable, someone who could face down even the toughest adversaries. Later that day, as Elena prepared for another surgery, a nurse approached her hesitantly. "Dr. Carter," she said, "are you worried Razor might come back?" Elena looked up, her expression calm. "If he does, we'll handle it." The nurse nodded, still looking unsure. "How are you so calm? After everything?" Elena paused, considering her words. Then she said, "Because I've learned that people like Razor only have power if you let them. And I don't let them." It was both a warning and a promise. Elena Carter wasn't just a surgeon. She was a force to be reckoned with, and now, everyone knew it. The bikers may have left, but their presence lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Whispers circulated around the hospital, the kind that traveled from break rooms to nurses' stations and even to the cafeteria. Razor's reputation wasn't confined to the hospital walls. He was known across the city for his ruthlessness, and some staff couldn't shake their unease. "What if they come back?" one nurse muttered as she poured a cup of coffee. "They wouldn't dare," said another, though her voice betrayed doubt. "Didn't you see the way Dr. Carter handled him? Razor looked like a kicked puppy walking out of here." Still, not everyone was so reassured. Mr. Logan himself paid a visit to Elena's office, his tie slightly loosened as he closed the door behind him. "Dr. Carter," he began, his tone more cautious than stern, "I've heard about the exchange with Razor. Are you certain this won't escalate?" Elena set down the patient chart she'd been reviewing, her expression calm. "Mr. Logan, I handled the situation. Razor knows he crossed a line. If he values his friend's life, he'll think twice before stepping foot in this hospital again." Logan hesitated, running a hand over his neatly combed hair. "I trust your judgment, but we've dealt with people like him before. They don't let things go easily." Elena didn't miss the flicker of doubt in his eyes, but she chose her words carefully. "I'm not afraid of Razor or his gang. My priority is this hospital and my patients. If they come back, they'll regret it." Logan nodded, though it was clear the conversation hadn't entirely put him at ease. "Just be careful, Dr. Carter. We can't afford unnecessary risks." Days passed, and though the ER returned to its usual chaos, the specter of Razor lingered. The nurses stayed alert, scanning for signs of trouble every time the sound of an engine roared in the distance. Elena, however, didn't waver. She moved through the hospital with her usual quiet confidence, tending to her patients and overseeing surgeries. Her confrontation with Razor had changed something, though. Staff members who once saw her as reserved now regarded her with newfound respect. "She didn't even flinch," one orderly said, recounting the story for the 10th time. "Razor's twice her size, and she looked him dead in the eye like he was nothing." "And did you hear what she said about being in the Navy?" a nurse added. "I always thought she was just another surgeon, but she's a total badass." Elena overheard snippets of these conversations but didn't acknowledge them. She wasn't looking for admiration or recognition, she just wanted to do her job. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot, a familiar roar broke the calm. The sound of motorcycles shattered the peace, and heads turned as Razor and two of his men strode into the ER. This time, Razor wasn't wearing his usual smug grin. His expression was colder, harder, and there was an edge of danger in his movements. The staff tensed, and the receptionist hesitated before greeting them. Can I help you?" she stammered. "We're here to talk to the doc," Razor said, his voice low but menacing. Elena stepped out from the hallway before anyone else could intervene. She didn't wait for an explanation, she simply folded her arms and met Razor's gaze head-on. "You've got 5 minutes. Make it quick." Her directness seemed to catch Razor off guard, but he quickly recovered. "Relax, Doc. We're not here to cause trouble. Just wanted to express our gratitude." Elena raised an eyebrow, her skepticism clear. "Gratitude?" Razor nodded toward his injured friend, who stood awkwardly behind him, his leg in a brace. "Red's alive because of you. He's walking because of you. I don't forget things like that." Elena's posture didn't soften. "If that's all, you're welcome. Now, if you don't mind." "Wait," Razor interrupted, holding up a hand. "There's more." Razor stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Elena could hear. "Look, Doc. I know I came in hot the other night. But I've got my reasons. My crew? They're my family. And when one of them gets hurt, I don't take it lightly." Elena's expression remained unreadable. "You think that justifies threatening a hospital staff?" Razor shrugged. "Maybe not. But I've seen too many people screw us over. You don't exactly live our life, so you wouldn't understand." Elena's voice was cold. "Try me." Razor hesitated, then sighed. "We're not just some gang looking for trouble, okay? We protect our own. And sometimes, that means crossing lines people don't like." Elena stared at him, her sharp eyes unrelenting. "What do you want from me, Razor? An apology? Forgiveness? Because you're not getting either." "No," Razor said quickly, shaking his head. I wanted to say thanks. And maybe, truce." The word hung in the air, surprising even Razor. It wasn't in his nature to back down, much less offer peace. But something about Elena, her fearlessness, her refusal to be intimidated, had shifted the balance. Elena considered his words for a long moment before replying. "If you're serious about keeping the peace, then I'll hold you to it. But if you ever step out of line in this hospital again, I won't hesitate to shut you down." Razor smirked, though it lacked his usual arrogance. "Fair enough, Doc. Fair enough." He extended a hand. For a moment, Elena didn't move, but then, with deliberate calm, she reached out and shook it. As Razor and his crew left the hospital, the tension in the air finally lifted. The staff watched from a distance, their faces a mix of relief and disbelief. "She actually made peace with Razor," one nurse whispered. "More like she put him in his place," another replied. Elena returned to her work as though nothing had happened, but the impact of her actions rippled through the hospital. Word spread beyond the walls of St. Mark's, and soon, people were talking about the unshakable surgeon who stood toe-to-toe with one of the city's most feared men. For Elena, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about standing up for what mattered: her patients, her team, and the integrity of her hospital. But deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Razor had offered a truce, but only time would tell if he truly meant it. Elena Carter was ready for whatever came next. The hospital's usual rhythm began to return as the roar of motorcycle engines faded into the distance. Staff members exchanged relieved glances, some muttering about how close they'd come to a real disaster. The tension that had gripped the emergency room was finally lifting, replaced by a hum of admiration for the doctor who had faced Razor without breaking a sweat. Nurse Patel, still clutching a chart to her chest, approached Elena cautiously. "Dr. Carter, that was incredible. You didn't just stand up to them, you handled Razor like it was nothing." Elena shook her head, her calm demeanor unwavering. "It wasn't nothing, Patel. People like him thrive on fear. The trick is to not let them see it." She glanced down at the patient monitor, double-checking that everything was stable. "Fear doesn't help anyone, not the staff, not the patients, and certainly not me. The hospital buzzed with stories about what had happened. Staff who had barely interacted with Elena before suddenly found themselves inspired by her courage. A janitor sweeping the hallway whispered to an intern, "Did you hear what she said to Razor? Told him she could take him apart and put him back together again. That's Navy training right there." "I always thought she was too quiet," the intern replied. "Guess she was just waiting for the right moment to show us who she really is." Elena didn't pay much attention to the chatter. She stayed focused on her rounds, ensuring every patient was cared for and every detail checked. But even she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in how people treated her. Where there had once been doubt or hesitation, there was now respect. 2 days later, a pair of officers arrived at the hospital. One was a grizzled veteran with a thick mustache, the other, a younger recruit who seemed eager to prove himself. "Dr. Carter," the older officer said, tipping his hat slightly. "We heard about the little standoff with Razor and his gang. Thought we'd check in to make sure everything's all right." Elena nodded, folding her arms. "The hospital's fine, and so is my staff. Razor didn't do anything beyond bluster this time." The younger officer frowned. "This time? You think he'll be back?" Elena's eyes narrowed. "People like Razor don't forget. He might stay away for now, but I doubt this is the last we'll hear from him." The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "Well, if he does come back, you give us a call. We've been trying to pin something on him for years. A few witnesses from this little incident might be all we need." Elena offered a polite smile. "I appreciate the concern, but we'll handle things. This hospital doesn't run on fear." Unbeknownst to Elena, her confrontation with Razor had far-reaching consequences. Word spread quickly through the city's underground, and not in Razor's favor. "You let a doctor talk you down," sneered one of Razor's rivals during a chance encounter at a seedy bar. "Did she offer you a lollipop afterward?" Razor's face darkened, his fist tightening around his drink. "Watch your mouth," he growled, but the damage was done. His reputation, built on intimidation and brute force, had taken a serious hit. Some of his own crew began questioning his authority, murmuring about how a single woman had managed to stare him down without breaking a sweat. For the first time in years, Razor felt something unfamiliar: vulnerability. Meanwhile, back at St. Mark's, Elena was taking precautions. Though she remained outwardly calm, she knew better than to underestimate Razor. She requested that the hospital's security be reinforced, with guards stationed near the entrances during late-night shifts. The staff, inspired by her leadership, followed her example. They organized emergency drills, made sure protocols were airtight, and doubled down on vigilance. "You think he'll actually come back?" Nurse Patel asked during one of the quieter moments. Elena didn't look up from the chart she was reviewing. "If he does, we'll be ready." 2 weeks later, just as the hospital staff began to feel a semblance of normalcy, Razor came back. This time, he wasn't flanked by his entire crew, just one other biker, the younger man who had spoken up during their last encounter. They walked into the hospital quietly, their presence sending a ripple of unease through the staff. Elena was in the middle of checking on a patient when Nurse Patel came rushing in. "Dr. Carter, Razor's here. He's asking for you." Elena didn't hesitate. "I'll handle it," she said, her voice as steady as ever. When she entered the waiting area, Razor stood there, looking strangely subdued. His younger companion had a bandaged arm and avoided eye contact with anyone. "Doc," Razor began, his voice gruff but lacking its usual edge. "I'm not here to make trouble. Just need some help." Elena's gaze flickered to the younger biker. "What happened?" Razor hesitated, then sighed. "Got into a scrap with the wrong people. Kid's hurt bad. Figured you were the best one to fix him up." Elena could feel every eye in the room on her. The staff watched in tense silence, waiting to see how she would respond. She folded her arms. You threatened my hospital, my staff, and my patients. Why should I help you? Razor looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time. Because you're better than me. And because I was wrong. His admission hung in the air, surprising everyone including Elena. She studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. Get him into a room. I'll take care of it. As Elena worked to treat the younger biker's injuries, Razor sat quietly in the hallway, a far cry from the arrogant bully who had stormed in weeks ago. When the procedure was done, Elena stepped out to find Razor waiting. He's going to be fine, she said briskly. Razor stood, looking uncharacteristically awkward. Thanks, Doc. I mean it. Elena's expression hardened. This is the last time, Razor. If you or your crew set foot in this hospital again without a good reason, I'll make sure the police are waiting for you. Razor nodded, his face serious. Understood. As Razor and his companion left, Elena watched them go, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Nurse Patel approached her, a mixture of awe and disbelief on her face. I can't believe it. You just treated Razor like he was anyone else. That's because he is, Elena replied simply. Everyone deserves a chance to be better, even people like him. Word of the encounter spread once more, solidifying Elena Carter's reputation not just as a skilled surgeon, but as someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the odds. Staff members walked a little taller, inspired by her courage and resilience. The hospital became a place where fear had no place, and respect for one another became the unspoken rule. And as for Elena? She went back to doing what she did best, saving lives, one patient at a time. The night was quiet now. The blaring engines of the motorcycles that had once rattled the walls of St. Mark's Trauma Center had faded into the distance. Yet the memory of the chaos, of the tense standoff, lingered in the air. It wasn't just the bikers or their threat that people remembered, it was Dr. Elena Carter, the woman who had stood firm in the face of danger. She hadn't been the loudest in the room. She hadn't demanded attention or even tried to make a statement. But her actions spoke louder than any words could. She had stood strong, unwavering, and in doing so, she had shown everyone around her what true strength looked like. The hospital returned to its usual rhythm. The sounds of footsteps echoed through the hallways. Nurses and doctors moved through the ER, checking on patients and making sure everything ran smoothly. But there was something different about the way they moved now. There was a quiet confidence in their steps. A sense that the calm, measured pace of their work was as important as the speed with which they responded to the emergencies that came through those doors. Elena continued with her rounds, her focus unbroken. She never sought the spotlight, never asked for praise. But people around her began to see something they hadn't before, quiet power. As the days passed, word about the confrontation with Razor spread, not just through the hospital, but through the community. Stories about the quiet surgeon who stood up to a gang leader and his crew began to circulate, each retelling a bit more inspiring than the last. Some people, once skeptical of Elena's quiet nature, began to see her in a new light. They realized that sometimes, strength isn't about how loud you are or how forceful you seem. Sometimes, strength comes from simply staying calm, no matter what life throws your way. You think Dr. Carter will ever get the credit she deserves? Nurse Patel asked one morning as they walked down the hallway. The younger nurse beside her shook his head, a grin spreading across his face. I don't think she cares about credit. I think she just wants to do her job, help people, and make sure no one's left behind. But yeah, I think we're all starting to see her for who she really is. Patel smiled. She's more than just a surgeon, huh? Much more, the younger nurse agreed. She showed us that true power isn't in how much noise you make. It's in how you stay calm when the world wants to knock you down. Elena's story wasn't one of flashy heroism or dramatic battles. It wasn't about taking down the big bad guy or saving the day with a single heroic gesture. No, it was about something far more powerful. It was about standing up in the face of adversity and showing that you can handle anything life throws at you without losing your composure. What happened at St. Mark's that night wasn't just a victory for Elena, it was a victory for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. It was a reminder that sometimes, the quietest people in the room are the ones you should never underestimate. Because you never know what strength they're holding inside, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And that was the real lesson from that night: quiet confidence can be just as powerful, if not more so, than any outward show of force. Elena's response to Razor's gang wasn't just about protecting the hospital or keeping control in a tense situation, it was about standing firm in her own truth. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She knew who she was, and in that certainty, she found her strength. Dr. Carter never changed after that night. She continued to show up every day with the same calm professionalism that had always defined her. She didn't crave recognition, and she didn't want anyone to see her as a hero. What mattered to her was that she could continue doing what she loved: helping people, saving lives, and making a difference where it counted. But the people around her noticed. They saw her strength, her calm under pressure, and they began to trust her more, not just as a surgeon, but as a leader. They began to see that true leadership isn't always about being the loudest or most forceful in the room. Sometimes, the best leaders are the ones who remain steady when everyone else is losing their heads. They are the ones who can hold their ground and face challenges without flinching, without fear. They lead with grace and confidence, not through domination, but through resilience. As Elena moved through the hospital every day, her quiet strength became a beacon for others. Doctors, nurses, and staff who had once doubted her began to look up to her. They saw that her way of handling stress, her ability to remain calm when things got tough, was the mark of a true leader. They started to ask themselves, what can I learn from Dr. Carter's calm? How can I handle my own challenges with the same strength? It wasn't just her skills as a surgeon that made Elena stand out. It was her ability to stay composed, to handle pressure without losing sight of her goals. In a world that often values loud voices and bold actions, Elena's quiet confidence served as a reminder that sometimes, the most powerful force in the room is the one that says the least. Her strength was in her actions, not her words. It was in the way she handled Razor's crew without flinching. It was in the way she treated every patient with the same respect, regardless of who they were. It was in the way she kept calm when everyone around her was panicking. And maybe that was the most important lesson of all. Elena Carter's journey didn't end that night in the ER. It didn't end when Razor and his gang left the hospital with their tails between their legs. No, Elena's story was just beginning. Because the true test of strength isn't how you handle the big moments, it's how you keep going after those moments pass. It's about showing up every day, facing the unknown, and continuing to do your best even when no one is watching. For Elena, that was her life. Every day, she walked into the hospital ready to face whatever came her way. And every day, she did it with grace and strength, knowing that sometimes the quietest voices have the most power. The world may be full of loud noises, flashy gestures, and quick fixes, but the true measure of strength comes from those who endure, who stay true to themselves, and who lead with humility. As the hospital continued its daily operations, Elena's actions that night became more than just a story to be told. They became a lesson in resilience, a lesson in standing firm when it feels like the world is pushing against you. And for everyone who had witnessed what happened, whether they were there in the ER or had heard the story from a colleague, it became clear: sometimes, the people you least expect have the most power. And when those people step into the spotlight, it's a reminder that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes, it's loud and proud. But sometimes, it's silent and steady. And in the end, it's the steady ones who leave the biggest impact. Dr. Elena Carter had proved that, and her story would resonate for a long time.